Hello, my name is Ishtar. I had an NDE at the age of 13, and my story starts sometime a little bit after my birth. So I have to start my story around my birth just because it sets up the whole thing in a very strange way. I grew up in a little town called Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. I actually had a strangely stable existence compared to a lot of my friends, in which I was in my crib, was in my bed, and graduated high school all within the same room until leaving home. And I had a lot of interesting things which I didn't think were interesting when I was growing up. For instance, in the crib, I would have people who weren't part of my family walk through my room at night. And some of these people would walk through the closed doors and walk through the back wall. And as I wasn't afraid of these because I hadn't yet learned the concept of ghost or spirit or any of this stuff, I didn't know enough to be afraid, but these things were happening. And thankfully, I had parents who, as I was growing up and learning about these sorts of things and these sorts of perceptions, they allowed these things to kind of be in the category of the imagination, which was great because then these things didn't shut down. So this sort of stuff happened through childhood here and there. Of course, as you get older, these things kind of start to fade out. Maybe the most important thing that didn't fade so quickly was something that I even took more for granted and thought was even less interesting than these strange visitors who would come in my room and want my help in going to their next destination. And the interesting thing, which comes up later in the NDE, was a sense of unity with everything. I even remember when I was first learning language and I was learning pronouns, I was learning how to say, this is me, this is you, all these sorts of things, chair, box, learning the nouns for everything around me. But even as I was learning those things, there was a sense that I was in those things. I would look at the shelf, and there was a sense that there was no boundary between whatever I was and whatever the shelf was, and whatever my crib was, and whatever, whoever my mother was. I knew there were differences on the surface, and I would watch myself have, regular child temper tantrums at a skin knee and other things, or not being able to watch Ghostbusters when I wanted to watch Ghostbusters, for instance. And yet behind all that activity, there was this peace. That was the most important thing about that unity, which I took for granted. There was this deep sense of silence and peace back there. And there was a sense that somewhere in my heart there was a door that just went forever and ever and ever. And that sense started to fade out around age 7, going to school. And so, like most kids, I was, trying to be, loved, liked, important, do well, really an exhausting operation that we all put ourselves through. And so, I was doing that. And I think by the age of 13, I have to say I was getting pretty good at playing that game, which isn't necessarily what the universe had really wanted me to develop. Fast forward now to June 5th, 1997. I was playing the last, because funnily in Little League, we had preseason games, which to me makes no sense. Anyhow, I was playing the last Little League preseason game, and I got hit by a pitch, a real zinger of a fastball. I got hit by a pitch right here, and I proceeded to go and pitch the next inning with this pain right there. And then after practice or after this game, we found out that I in fact had a broken arm, and so we had it in a sling. So that night I was distraught, you know, because the baseball season was one of the highlights of my year. I did very well at it, and it was a place I could shine. And so, oh my God, I was distraught. And I was talking with my mother, kind of calming myself down, getting used to, adjusted to my new life, that I would have half the season that I wouldn't be playing or something like that. And then all of a sudden, as I was talking to her, I found moving out of my mouth the words, are you going to die soon, Mom? And they came out of my mouth with, I didn't think them, they just came out. And there was a real power to them. And I remember it even affected my mother, who really had 2 feet on the ground. She was that type of person. She's a fairly formidable person, strong-minded, very together. And so to see her be momentarily affected by these words as well was something that I registered. And so, she quickly shook it off, whatever registered affecting her. And then she said, like, no, I'm not going to die. And then she corrected herself. Oh, I'm going to die someday, of course, but just not for a while longer. And she promised to me that, for as long as you need me, I'm going to be around. And so I felt, okay, that's great. I can shake this thing off too, whatever came out of my mouth. A little bit of background. I never had this fear about my mother ever. She was fairly healthy, and this never crossed my mind as an anxiety. It just wasn't there. So that's made it extra surprising to have that be there. And so I went to bed, relaxed. I woke up the next morning like a cartoon character, almost trampolining up out of bed, as if I possessed suddenly some secret ninja muscles that you read about. And I was also panting, as if I'd just gotten done with a race, as if I'd just run from somewhere into my body, really. And at that moment, my mother and my father were walking outside my bedroom door, which I always kept open on account of the ghosts. I kind of felt comfortable having an escape route. That's funny, but that's why I did that. And so I saw them outside the door, and they were like, "What's wrong?" Because they could notice I was panting and really distraught. And I said, "There's something I have to tell you. There's something I have to tell you." And I was so frustrated because I couldn't remember what it was I was supposed to tell them. And I was like, I can't remember it. I was and they had to spend 5 minutes because I was so distraught. They had to kind of calm me down and tell, I'm sure it's fine. And so then they went off on their morning walk. This was about 6 a.m., something like that. They went off on their morning walk. I got ready to go to school. I went to school, basically second to the last day of school, come home after an easy peasy day of no work and awards ceremony and stuff like that. And we're sitting on the couch and we're watching a movie. No, nothing going on there. Then we drive my sister off to her new job location, which was kind of on the edge of town, new movie theater they just built, and drop her off there. And as we're pulling out, leaving the parking lot of the movie theater, we're kind of going across one of these two and two lane divided highways that you find a lot. And we drive out, and there were some cars over there, and they were well down the road and going slow, so there was no sense of danger. I was turning my head to talk to my mother. I think I was about to complain about how I didn't want to listen to Luther Vandross again. No offense to Luther Vandross or anything. And as I was doing that, there was a large car just about to hit us, a big Lincoln Continental or Town car or something like that, just about to hit us right outside the driver's side door of our little Chevrolet. And at that moment, and instead of freezing in fear, I did have enough time to think two thoughts consciously. The first thought was shit, because it seemed fairly, in my mind, it seemed apparent that this was the end of this lifeline. You know, this was it, because the thing must have been going 60, 65 miles per hour. It's really big car going fast. And and the next thought was actually, instead of freezing up and tightening up, I became so loose. I became progressively loose in that millisecond or whatever it was. And I thought, I really thought that this life was going to go longer. It was kind of like almost like I was talking to somebody. Like, I thought this one was going longer. Like if you're reading a script or a novel or something like that. And then all of a sudden, I was completely overtaken by this. It almost felt like a physical process. But I started to have my entire life flash before my eyes, which was something I was always curious about as a youth. When I read about that, I thought, how is that possible to have all the information of a life go? And there we were. Except it was greater than I was imagining it. It was every single moment in the seamless loop. So it seemed, of course, you could be skeptical of this, obviously, and maybe you should be, but every single moment seamlessly. Only it was more, as I experienced in this place, it was more than I had experienced in most of those moments. And most of those moments, I realized in this process that I was half asleep at best, some of these moments, I think I was about 75 to 80% asleep to life and to what was going on, really. And I had no idea how much I was missing, even as a fairly unstressed 13-year-old. And as I went through this process, it was as if I was connected to a completely, wholly objective aspect of consciousness, which I had experienced in early childhood frequently, and which I sporadically experienced after age 7 because I often didn't like what it would tell me. uh, I'd have these plans and it'd say probably a bad idea and be like, shut up, I'd go do the plans and it would be a bad idea. Anyhow, here I was in contact with this thing, and where there was fear, where I had acted with pettiness, where I was holding some kind of grudge that I wasn't releasing, all of these things that were shown to me to basically be the instruments that actually blocked my full experience of life were coming up and were being forgiven in some way. The mechanism for given is I can't even put words to it because it felt physical, as if my heart was being, my inner body, my heart, my soul, all of it was being massaged by love. And so here we were going and going and going back. With 13 years, it's not exactly a long reel of tape. And we're going through every moment. There were moments where once I was roughed up, which was felt, like that was a rough moment. I think that was psychologically affecting. Picked on and roughed up and thrown into a chain link fence, uh, uh, face hitting it. I remember in that moment I was connecting to this other, maybe you could say higher aspect. You could use the word higher self if you want, aspect of myself that was fully present there. I was saying like, and its perception of the moment was completely different than my stressed out one because it was going like, oh, this is fantastic. Oh yeah, this is great. This experience right here is going to be a great thing to heal later. To totally set this one. And I was like, and parts of my more limited consciousness that were kind of starting to merge with this were going like, really? Good Lord. Okay. And so there we were going. And as we moved backwards, there's this complete sense of being merged into, I could say love, I could say light, I could say being. Really, any word that you put to it is a poor facsimile into this profound oneness, which was being revealed in the life review as the core constituent of all experience. And so as I matured in this life review with this guide, I was seeing that everything that had ever transpired to me, every molecule in every scene of life was in fact informed by an intelligent love the whole time. And I was also doubly experiencing that the real me, the real pronoun I should be using was not limited to this sort of body mind with its biography, but in fact the real me the whole time was actually in everybody and everything all at once, even in the buildings and the inanimate objects. The real, what I could call real, calling the biographical self real in the light of that experience was a was silly. It was so limited. And so here we were. Then the tape ends, and there was this fascinating sensation as if I had a skin that I was wearing my entire life suddenly pulled off, and it was an invisible skin, and it was massless, except it felt like it weighed the weight of the world, and this complete sense that I was carrying around all this weight of fear and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and that was gone. And so back in real time, I haven't even been hit by the car yet. This is one of the reasons I barely ever considered this an NDE because I'd watched that film Flatliners, and I was like, oh man, that shit's intense, man. I didn't have any of that stuff going on, but I hadn't been hit by the car yet, and this was the most alive I'd ever been in my life to that point, in some ways, except maybe some parts of early childhood. Was sitting there waiting for the physical death and having it not matter one iota because I was realizing that I was all of life everywhere. It didn't matter. I was in my mother's shoulder in her head that I could see. I was in the car. I was in the clouds in the distance. I was in the driver who seemed to maybe already be drunk or unconscious or something. As he was approaching us, I was everywhere and nowhere all at once. And more than that, I realized that I was being massaged actively by love coming from everywhere. It was the largest thing I could imagine, as if somehow we have to go to William Blake, eternity's in a grain of sand. There was a sense of, like, almost like a holograph, as if somehow everything that I was looking at was infinitely packed, far greater than the scene of life. And what that was infinitely packed with was this vastness. And oh, how wonderful. And so then, boom, we're hit. Impact is made. I remember quickly being thrust to my right and knocking my head into the glass of the window of the car door. Why I didn't have a bruise is beyond me, but that knocked me out. You know, cold. That was a concussion. And then I wake up, and it was, you know, I wake up to the sound of the seatbelt, bing, ding, ding, seatbelt bell going off, people outside the car, EMT workers approaching the car, getting their giant sort of skill saws out to, because the doors didn't work, have to cut the car open to get us out of there. My mother was clearly, um, fighting for her life, labored breathing. I was concussed, so none of this was really registering all that much. I didn't know what my name was when they took me out and put me on the gurney. They're like, "What's your name?" It's like, I have no idea what my name is, but that's my mom over there. So it's like that's what I knew. It's like, that's my mom over there. No, and nothing else. And so they're taking us. They did a very fine job of making sure that I didn't have any spinal injuries. They were real pros, I could tell that. And got us out, got us in the ambulance. We're speeding away. I'm experiencing that thing that later I read other people have, where you're both in your body and you're also looking down at your body. So I was kind of, I didn't look both ways, so I couldn't, look at my own eyes or anything like that. But I was up there, and they're working on both of us, much more my mother, because I seemed to be okay, which was, not bizarre because her car got hit, but her side got hit, but I don't know how I got up there. The only injury besides a concussion that I picked up from that accident, ironically, we were going to the same hospital at that time, which was bizarre, for me. A bizarre coincidence. We were going to put a cast on my broken arm, and I broke my middle finger. So I went around the next summer with a cast for a little while, which looked like this. Uh, so cast on the arm and the little, flange. Very that was completely poetically fitting, because of course I went through that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross anger stage for a good amount of time, and so that was a perfect reflection of a big part of how I felt. Anyhow, there's a digression. Back to the scene. We're in the ambulance. She calls my name out a couple times. I say twice, "I'm okay, Mom." She doesn't register the first one. She definitely registers the second one. I know that because her breathing shifted from being um, broken to calming down, and that was in probably the most touching moment of my life in many ways, and one of the things that informs every other moment that comes after. To witness somebody staying inside a broken body to make sure that their loved one is okay, that was it. And when I said that the second time, and I her breathing changed, I felt a whoosh go by me. I didn't think that had anything to do with my mom not being alive in the body anymore. But I was up there, up there, at the top of the ambulance, and I had felt connected to her up there. Like, so when she spoke, I could hear it through these ears down in the gurney, but I heard it more directly, I don't know, in my soul or in my mind or in my extended mind that was up at the top. There wasn't a sense of a difference between her and I in many ways. And then I felt that breeze, softer than the whoosh, more of a time was really kind of, compressed the sense of it. And we ended up at the hospital, and she was being cared for, worked on behind the curtains. I was out. They figured I was pretty okay. I was still sort of strapped down in case I had spine or neck issues. And then we heard the news, your mother's gone. And that, of course, was the hardest sentence I'd ever heard in my life, maybe ever will. And so, then it was just tears, nothing mystical there, just tears as you walk out of a hospital. And the Lutheran social service, well-meaning Lutheran social service people kind of try to hug you. I didn't really want to be hugged. At that point, just walked out. And so, the following days were kind of just sort of happened. And maybe after about a week, I can't say that things normalized, but after about a week, I started noticing strange things to me. Um, my mother had, I think, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book on death and dying. I think that was the book that I was reading. My mother had studied to be a therapist. And so we kind of received a secondhand education early in ideas of therapy and psychology. So at least I benefited from her library, and I could clock the stages of grief that I was going through. I was like, okay, that's happening. And not only was I'm not afraid of anything in a way that I had never experienced before, that I felt weightless. First, I thought what I was experiencing was shock because I felt all this joy and bliss coming out of my inner body. I also was back in childhood in a way that didn't feel like it was in childhood, but was more augmented. There was silence everywhere inside me, all around me. It felt like the back of my head wasn't there in a good way. It felt like if I closed my eyes or if I simply moved my attention back, I found myself in an endless space. And whenever I would put myself in that endless space, bliss would run up through my body. And I started experimenting with that. I could do it in my heart as well. I could do it down in my stomach. There were doorways in all these places, and I would find myself falling back into them and falling into this vastness. I remember one time I wanted to ask my dad about this. I was very cautious about sharing these inner things because there was a deep part of me that said, don't share it with anybody, especially the adults, because they probably won't understand, and that'll probably stultify what you're experiencing. That was sort of an inner guide. So like, okay, that makes sense. And I was about to say, Dad, are you experiencing this joy? And then, just as I said, Dad, the answer was he's absolutely not. So I was like, okay, we're not going to talk about this. And this was there mostly on, a little bit off sometimes through a couple months. It was there at the same time that I was pounding my fists against the garage wall in anger and pleading to be given my mother back. It was there at the same time where I would wake up in the morning hoping that the last however many days had just been a dream, and that I would be waking up, June 6th, 1997 again. And yet this peace was still behind everything. And so that was a different sort of thing. Eventually that faded. I went back to school. I went back to eighth grade, and I tried to I suppose I tried to be the person that I was before the NDE, in a way. And in some ways, I was outwardly seemed successful at doing that. There were a lot of things that I had been pursuing that I achieved. I got to be student, little things. I got to be student body president. I was treasurer of this and secretary of that. I get an award for education, the President's Medal for Education, all these things that I had wanted. And most of them were in a sense fairly meaningless, which was a shock to me. I don't know why it was a shock, but it was. And so I spent about a year maybe trying to fit into my old skin, which was now ill-fitting, totally ill-fitting. And then one day I was walking with my big sis, who I love so much, and I would, go to places I wouldn't normally go to, like different sort of shops that bored the hell out of me. I would just go along as a dutiful younger brother and, maybe learn something. And so we went to a metaphysical bookstore, and I had no interest in metaphysical bookstores up to that point in my life. And as I associated them, like, I don't want to go to an incense shop with weird, like wind chimes. I don't need incense or wind chimes, little did I know. So I went in the back of the room, and in the back room was a book I picked up at random. It was on Himalayan yogis and their experiences. I opened it and started reading a page at random, and it was it seemed to be sharing to me all those experiences that I knew weren't shock, that I had been experiencing about a year before. And I read through it and read through it. It's like one page after the next, one experience after the next. I was like, oh my God, that dimension they're talking about, I must have tapped into that. It's like, whoa, okay. So I suddenly became very interested in the metaphysical bookstore, and I would come in often to try to read this or that different book. And I started to get a sense maybe this was why all this happened to me. Maybe this was why I saw it beforehand. I always had a sense that it was kind of part of the plan since I saw it beforehand. In some way, I thought, okay, there must have been some kind of plan. Why the fuck would you take such a wonderful woman away from the world? And why would you take my mother away from the world? I have to make this worth it in some way. That was how I felt at the time. I thought, she's such a wonderful person. I don't know if I'm ever going to measure up to her impact in the world. I have to do my best. I'm not saying that's necessarily a good motivation to have, but it was there. That's what a big part of my motivation. So I went into this bookshop, tried to learn as much as I could, wound up being mentored by people who, when I was around them, I was suddenly taken back to that place of presence that I was experiencing so deeply in that summer after my mother died that I had been in childhood. And I was just doing everything I could to get to that place. And that that was the rocket fuel for the next few years of sort of being maybe I think a bit of a lazy high school spiritual seeker until my junior year, and which the Jets came on. Later, I always had wanted a connection with my mother. I wanted to experience her spirit. I mean, I experienced so many rando spirits in my life. I was like, why can't I meet my own mom? It's like I begged for it. I pleaded with the universe, nothing. And then I went to this, meet your spirit guide workshop at the bookstore. I only had to pay like $5, as a kid. And apparently I did meet them. I rocketed out my top of my head to this room, and these beings were talking about my life trajectory, and then they looked at me. It's like, what the hell are you doing here? Go back down. And they're like, I'm sorry, but you're not going to meet your mother's spirit for a while. It's part of the plan. It's like, oh shit, and so I was like, all right, okay, I'm cool with that. At least these spirit guides, they must, have a good idea of what's going on. And bizarre experiences in this life, by the way. And that was, that was that for a while. And I went and became a heavy meditator and put in long hours, had an ascetic period, found a practice that I still do now called ascension meditation, joined a monastery. I was in my meditation teacher training, and this was a period in which you put in long hours of meditation every day for about 6 months. So it was about, I don't know, two-thirds of the way through. And I was walking to the bathroom. Sometimes I would bloody walk with my eyes closed, which was silly, but I knew the hallways. And I was walking to the bathroom. I came into the bathroom, looked in the mirror, and it was in a non-scary way. There was my mother's face merged into my face. And it wasn't a sort of biological similarity sort of thing. It was her face in my face, and her presence, which when you're around someone, they have a certain feel to them. I'd forgotten what her feel was like. And there it was. And it was just total, like, you did it. That was the sense that I got from the face looking back at me. You ran the obstacle course. This was where you were trying to get. You did it. And that was profoundly healing because I kind of made myself a bit of a black sheep by taking my particular life course of becoming some kind of sketchy monk in Oregon instead of I don't know, going and becoming a lawyer as quickly as possible. And, years later, I had another encounter with her. I was on my honeymoon. It was significant because as a 12-year-old and a 13-year-old and 11-year-old, I would take walks with my mom. She would often say, I really want to get back to. I want to go back to Amsterdam and Florence. And she'd say, yeah, Florence is my favorite city in the world. So when you graduate high school, I'm going to take you on a trip before you go off to university. We're going to go to Florence. You're going to experience the city that touched me so profoundly. Of course, we never got to take that trip. And so there I was, not even necessarily consciously informed by those conversations, just I wanted to go to Italy on my honeymoon, so did my wife. And one of the cities was Florence, and there we were in Florence, and it ended up that I had to climb Giotto's bell tower alone. My wife had an ankle injury, and so she wanted me to go climb it. Like, okay, I'll do it. And as I was climbing this tower, I realized I was looking out this window. I was all by myself, which was great. Looking out this window over the hills around Florence and the dome of the Duomo next to it. And I smelled my mother's perfume. There's nobody around. It came out of nowhere. I didn't remember what her perfume smelled like, but as soon as it came up, I remembered all those memories from childhood. And I felt her presence, and I felt armor on my shoulder as I looked out, and I realized that since the stairs are so narrow, I'd in fact obviously been treading the very same stairs that my mother had tread some 42, 42 years before. It's a little coincidence, you know. Maybe somebody uh, had the same perfume. I don't think so. There was nobody around me at the time, and so that was a profound moment. I don't know, the purpose of these stories is, in some way that there's connections in all sorts of different ways that are open all the time. I think the most important part, what if there's some deal between my mother and I to push me in a certain direction, it was that I think what she was seeking in a certain way was the same thing that I sought in a more heavy way, which was freedom, which was the peace that passes all understanding. I think that's the core import. There's a lot of important and interesting things about near-death experiences, but I think maybe at the core of them, at the very bottom of that experience, is a underlying unity that frees one from existential suffering. There is a profound peace that the more we contact it and the more we bathe in it, transforms our lives in ways that we often, frankly, don't think can be transformed. And so that that is my NDE. I never left the other side, and I don't even like to call it the other side. I think that's actually, um, there's a quote in the Bible: "The kingdom of heaven is within." You know, the kingdom of heaven is here and now. The kingdom of heaven is within. That's the other side is here all the time, and it's not another side. It's our essence. So I'll leave you with that. You don't have to have an NDE to find this place. You can find it in all sorts of ways. You can trip and fall into it. We do all the time. Abraham Maslow called it the peak experience, and I think the core of the peak experience is same core as the NDE. Maybe not as intense sometimes, but it can be. It's there. And your deepest meditation that you've ever had, where you were in pristine, total silence and totally everywhere. That's the same territory we're talking about here. So I invite you to that.